Sure. Very good. And okay. So can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, let's see. Uh there. Um, so we're going to be talking about a rather novel approach to psychotherapy training, and that is to make non-denominational psychotherapy training a reality. So I want to thank Jeff for inviting me to do this. And Jeff Harris is one of the founders and proponents of unification, of the unification model of psychotherapy integration. And unification means building kind of a roof over psychotherapy, a large container within which all the different therapies can fit, because they share a lot of common conceptualizations. And what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about what's kind of the opposite of that. We're going to be talking about building a foundation under the various psychotherapies, a foundation made of universal processes and principles that apply to all therapies. So let me go on with this. Here we hold on. There we go. No, why is there we go. So for both trainees and for experienced therapists, it turns out to be really quite helpful to have a clear idea of what the underpinnings are, what's working behind the scenes about psychotherapy. It naturally, and this has been one of my aims, decreases the importance of sticking to a particular brand. That's why I have the silos over there on the left, because unfortunately, psychotherapy is really divided up very much into silos that don't communicate with each other very well. And that's really a problem both for trainees and for clients and for the field in general. And so my thinking is that as we understand what these things have in common, what different therapies have in common, then the differences between them begin to be less important and actually more useful. So knowing this helps us control processes instead of following a set method. And the more you do that, the more we can watch change happen and make it happen instead of kind of waiting for it. And also, knowing the infrastructure allows intelligent mixing of techniques in the same therapy and makes it more natural to match the therapy to the client instead of the client to the therapy. Let's see. So I think this is an important time for the field of psychotherapy, that we're kind of coming to age. The two pictures of trees there kind of represent the state of psychotherapy as it had been, and the one on the right as it can be, because when the great inventors of the major psychotherapies did their work, nobody really understood at all about how the brain works, how the mind works. And so they had to invent their own conceptual frameworks to make some sense out of what they observed. And the idea was to do something that was quite elegant. For example, Freud came up with the idea of drives, and that was an invention. But I think now we can see it more from the point of view of evolution, as we'll be talking about that in a moment. SEPI's mission has been to bring them together. It turns out that's not so easy to do. But for the first time since the science from the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century allows us to understand really what's going on behind the scenes, and that creates a kind of Rosetta Stone, so that if we understand the basic processes, then we can see how they're described in different terms in different therapies, and we have a common set of principles and processes that apply to all therapies. So in a way, we're adding the trunk and roots that have been missing, that validate and support the beautiful branches and roots that have already been developed in the field of psychotherapy. So this is a little bit about myself, how I got here. This is actually where we are now is the culmination of many years of thinking and observing and conceptualizing and teaching, starting with my first trauma patients, where I began to realize that there were more than one change process going on there as people healed in therapy for their trauma. And eventually that led to being asked, would I be interested in teaching a course on combining psychodynamic and behavioral therapies? And I said to my training director, sure, I'd love to do that because that's what I do anyway. And I did, and began to think about it and develop a handout. And pretty soon I was teaching the same thing for my general psychotherapy class as I was for the psychotherapy integration class. And ultimately, I joined SEPI then, and wrote a paper that was based on observation about two different pathways to healing that I'd noticed in trauma. More years passed, and eventually I wrote a textbook, which to my knowledge is the only textbook of psychotherapy that does not lean towards any one orientation or brand of therapy. It's entirely non-denominational. And that led to some more teaching, and eventually to the podcast that follows the chapters in the book, and a year-long course with advanced therapists where we also followed the book. And then more recently, we realized that it was important for psychiatry residents and other trainees to be able to put together as compact a version of this infrastructure as we could. And so we developed, with help from one of the people who are here with me, Joseph Vinson, to put together a 10-hour recorded course. We recorded 10 sessions with a live audience of psychiatry residents and other therapists. And that is what's now available as a self-paced course with a workbook and so on. We'll be talking a little more about that later. And then after launching the course, it became clear that people really needed some additional support in applying these principles and ideas to therapy in general. And so we developed a psychotherapy coaching community, which includes a couple of coaching sessions per month and access to a group, sort of like a Facebook group or something like that. It's a private group where people can share their experiences and questions and successes. And so that's now a going thing as well. So that's how, and one of the turning points really was 2015, when I first learned that neurophysiologists had been busy explaining the things that I was describing in my 2004 article. And so that really is what kind of brought science together with careful descriptive observation and helped to build an idea of how to make sense out of where we are in therapy at any given time and what to do next. So I'm going to turn the session over to Joseph Vinson, who is assistant professor of psychiatry at Emory University and has been very much involved in training of residents and has been familiar with the work that we've been doing and was part of the development of the 10-hour class. So I'm going to stop my share here and ask Joseph to take over.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of my perspective. And speaking of which, it's definitely limited and biased and distorted and everything else. So kind of keep that in mind. But it is coming specifically from a psychiatry perspective, which I think is, has some unique aspects to it. The first thing I wanted to talk about, and just in terms of the problem and what I see as the sort of state of things, at least again from where I'm sitting, is the ACGME, the governing bodies that we have. There's the psychiatry milestones and the ACGME, and it's sort of reflects this older traditional model of you need to learn CBT, you need to learn psychodynamic, and you need to learn supportive, And then I think that unless people are really really pushing the envelope, that's the way that training ends up going. And it's very often, your second year of training or even third year of training, you get a CBT case, CBT supervisor, or vice versa. And then people would like to be able to integrate at some point. And I think that there's people pay lip service to this idea that, yeah, once you learn and you get pretty good at a couple of different approaches, then you can eventually integrate. Problem is, it doesn't really happen very often. And what does happen more often is that people feel incompetent and they feel the pressure to see a lot of patients and a lot of sick patients, and then ultimately don't really use psychotherapy much at all, and end up just sort of sticking with, med management or other modalities. And there's also this issue of physician burnout, especially since the pandemic. And so I think that this has something to do with it as well. It is not really being able to use the skills and the experiences that they have in training on the ground. And so another way I wanted to kind of think about it, recently I have this sort of existential background, and this idea of there's this meaning crisis, according to John Vervaeke and various others. And I was just thinking about how this might apply, in the psychiatry world. If you break down meaning into a sense of purpose and significance and coherence, I think this kind of applies to where we are as a field, in the sense that, yeah, maybe there's a sense of purpose and direction, and here's what I'm supposed to do as a psychiatrist, and then but then occasionally there's this issue with significance, and you're adjusting meds and just kind of not really getting a whole lot of traction with the patient and not really making as much of a difference as you might like. And then definitely coherence. I think it's a problem. It's like, I'm trying to think of the best metaphor, but time and time again, I hear residents, and myself included, it's like walking into a library and trying to make sense of, what am I supposed to be learning here? There's so many different approaches, and the alphabet soup of, all the acronyms, and how do I integrate? And then when you're in the ER seeing a patient, or, something like that, there's just not, it's not serviceable, and it's not really coherent for a lot of residents. And so that does lead to a sense of meaninglessness as not to be dramatic about it, but I think that's how it sometimes can feel. And so then you stick to what which is, again, I'll just kind of adjust the meds and let somebody else do the therapy, which is unfortunate. And so I think what's needed, and like many others have been saying for decades now, is something that's relatively simple, and something that's understandable, and that can be taught by a lot of different people with different backgrounds, and also remembered, like, under pressure. And so that's where I think this approach, this model, whatever we're calling it, can be helpful, because then it can just be, oh yeah, what was that, couple of things that I remember, from, I think we'll get into more of the actual model, the EMPs and these kind of things. But yeah, and I think it does, it can lead to a sense of disorientation. So yeah, I think this is sort of partly where we're at. And I think particularly in psychiatry too, there's a lot of different types of patients, and a lot of times it's not this weekly therapy that's long-term and this kind of thing. It's more a patient with PTSD and bipolar disorder, and their own benzodiazepines and everything else, and you're trying to how do I use my psychotherapy knowledge to really help this patient get unstuck? And so yeah, again, we need a model or a framework that's agile, and that's flexible. And so I think that's one way that I sort of ended up at this point, was Well, maybe I'll get into that in a second, but in terms of like what's been done, I mean, we'll get into to what Dr. Smith has been working on for a long time. But I was really impressed with the APA Psychotherapy Caucus's new curriculum, integrated curriculum that's come out recently. That's another example for people who aren't aware of where, yeah, there is real progress. This is coming of age finally, and there are ways to integrate here. And I think, yeah, the work that SEPI's done, and I think ultimately a lot of people are much more explicitly working on this. It's just a lot of times we're working backwards, instead of working from the trees and the leaves down instead of the other way around. So maybe I'll sort of take a break there and then come back and share some of my personal experience with this particular type of training.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. And that's excellent. And now we're going to turn to Kelly Oldham. Kelly is the founder of Cultivate Counseling Group in Chicago, and she supervises and runs a clinic with about 15 therapists. And so she's very much involved in the growth and development of therapy skills. And so I'd like to introduce Kelly and have her talk a little bit about your view of training. So let's see, I'm going to stop the share again. And Kelly, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi from Chicago. Well, I come from a little bit of a different corner of the mental health field, just as a master's level clinician. And it's so interesting in the last few years as private practice has really exploded. I've really started to watch how clinicians grow, how they change. My own experience started pretty young. I was interested in the field, and like by 23, I had a license and was sitting with patients, and I just was so unequipped. But, I had my diagnoses, I had a couple theories I could lean on, and mostly I like leaned on my intuition, which was not enough. I had some success, and then I would hit plateaus, and I wouldn't know why I hit plateaus and why I didn't. So I would start to pour on the trainings, wonder if I should get my doctorate. What was the thing that I needed to do to become better? And I started to just really start to be a lot more thoughtful of that once my supervision ended. So not too soon after you're in the field in the master's level track, after 2 more years of supervision, that's all. And it wasn't enough. And so that is how I sought out Dr. Smith and found a lot of his stuff. And instead of doing EMDR training and polyvagal training, finding all of these sort of things that are really rich and really good. And I'm a little existential myself. And, I like the psychodynamic approach. And I think I actually did a little bit more of just kind of grabbing whatever tools seemed to work. And that sometimes would work, and it would sometimes leave me and the client confused. And so when I found this idea of having a framework of actually putting together the way people change, it simplified it as much as you can, right? And it let you kind of layer the different theories and the different way clinicians practice on top. But if we all had a similar map and a similar place we were going, it really started to click for us. So, Dr. Smith says a lot. He kind of talks about the science and the art. And I think some clinicians lean really heavy on one or the other. I know a ton who are just very kind of set in their ways. This is the way I practice, really kind of theory heavy. And I know a lot of other therapists that lean on the art, and they're a little bit lazy, and they kind of rely on how are you doing? And being able to do both and train therapists in both has actually been a really hopeful experience for me, because I have found that sometimes people feel a little lost. And I mean the therapist, the one, and that is not a really good, confident way to practice. And so zooming out, focusing on more of a framework has just really been instrumental in my training. I'll talk a little bit later how we implement that and how we can kind of see the different ways therapists are struggling, where they're getting stuck, where in one sort of tool, you could be colluding with a client's, EMP or dysfunctional behavior. And in another way, that could be sort of where they need to go. And this sort of idea, this teaching, this framework really clears that up in a really calming way. And I think it's given a lot of the people on my team a ton of confidence in sort of what they're doing, which has been great.
Excellent. That's terrific. I hope we're not too late. I promised Joseph that he could go and take care of his kids. Are you still there?
I'm still here. Yeah, I do have my 2-year-olds at daycare, and I can just.
Okay. So we're going to ask you just to talk a little bit more about your own personal experience as a therapist and watching the residents that you've been teaching and how your use of this framework has impacted your own work and what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean I think I come from a formerly sort of religious background, and so the idea, the idea of it being non-denominational was really appealing to me. I'll just say that in short. And I spent some time in the psychoanalytic world and the existential humanistic world, and again with ACT and DBT and everything else, and there's still just this sensibility that feels kind of denominational, if you will. So I think I was fresh out of training and then tasked with being a supervisor because there's a big need, and especially for MDs at our program, psychotherapy supervisors who are MDs. And then thinking, okay, what am I going to teach? It's day one. And then at some point I came across Dr. Smith's work, and I remember just seeing the book titled Psychotherapy, a practical guide. And I thought, now that's like my reading level, psychotherapy as a title. Wow. It's about right. And so I kind of went into that and, the podcast series. And I think having a variety of formats is really helpful for this generation of learners. So I use YouTube a lot with my residents, and so having different, there's a book, and then there's this level, and then now there's a little diagram, and then there's a podcast, which I think is helpful, just in general. But yeah, I think what I've found is that these days, at least again in my corner, it's you don't even really have to get buy-in anymore for integration. I think it's just that's the way people seem to be, at least in, again, the folks that I work with. You don't have to convince them. It's like, well, yeah, why can't we just be integrative sort of from the beginning? But there's still not really this clear path forward for how to do that. And so offering this alternative has been really, I think, enjoyable for the residents. It's a breath of fresh air to just be flexible. And I think it allows the creativity to come out too. I think there's a lot of times where, somebody might have somebody working with a unified protocol or something else, and then just feel kind of stifled a little bit. And that is something I want to highlight. Again, back to the burnout point is, it is important. The therapist needs to feel good about what they're doing and to enjoy it and to feel creative and to feel, rather than just sort of, okay, what's like scientifically the best possible, move here. I think that's part of the story, but there's more to it than that. And so that's been really sort of, I think I would highlight that. And I think the Rosetta Stone point is interesting. Maybe I'll go on audio at some point, maybe if I'm still around at the end after you kind of teach more about what this model actually is, I'll come back to it. But I do think that there is, just to name an example, earlier today, I played chess with my patient after the therapy session. And I think it was this EMP about him not being able to really play anymore. And then I think it was disconfirming and, disconfirm the narrative. And now there's this new learning ultimately. There's another example of I think somebody who's dealing with a loss of faith and a spiritual struggle. And I think that there's there's a sort of maladaptive pattern in his relationship with the divine, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I do think it can apply. And even in training too, with my residents, I think, this idea of, oh, how could I be a therapist? I don't know anything about therapy. Or can I work with trauma if I'm not a trauma specialist? And then I think that there's this, these sort of maladaptive patterns that become entrenched, and then you can sort of give new information with highlighting the, affect, and then here's the antidote. So anyway, just to point that out, not that it's a sort of a cure-all or anything like that, but I do think that it's simple enough that it can be applied in a lot of different settings. I'll put it that way. So yeah, I'm excited to see where it.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And I hope you have a good time with your son. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the course, and then fairly briefly about three pillars of science that really support the infrastructure that we're talking about. But I did want to say that both, I think Kelly and Joseph both represent a younger point of view, and that's really been the hurdle in helping people to understand this fairly simple infrastructure that we're talking about. The old people who are committed to one or other of therapies, and they built a career around that, don't see much interest in changing, and are not even aware that science has caught up with psychotherapy to the extent that it has. We're trying to get the word out to younger people and see it spread like that. So anyway, the 10-hour Psychotherapy Essentials course, the focus is really to help people understand what's going on and what to do next. That's really the focus. It's a very clinical approach. And we have, within the 10 classes, there are 4 milestones. The first one is we jump right into that red bullseye, the healing moment. And those are the moments when your client, you just know something important happened, and when they walk out of the session, they're a different person than when they walked in, and you both know that the change is permanent. Those are the kinds of moments that we really cherish and look for, and so we drill down right away to what makes those happen and what they're all about with the first of the 3 hours of classwork. And then the second milestone is being able to, it's a little bit still oriented towards the specific problems that people give us. That's the orange ring there, not the general atmosphere that's good for people, but the specifics that address the problems that they brought, because there's a little bit more complexity to how to get people to the healing moment. That doesn't just automatically happen. And then we spend 2 classes working on especially the relationship. I think of the therapeutic relationship, like other common factors, is kind of a Swiss Army knife of psychotherapy. It advances many, many different goals. It does a lot of positive things. And so we talk about building the relationship and maintaining it, but also some other aspects of the common factors that make therapy successful. And then finally, for the last 2 classes, we relate the framework that we've been talking about to the specifics of different therapies, psychodynamic approaches, experiential ones, third wave, and cognitive behavioral therapy, so that we help the people who are taking the course to actually make the connection and see how the framework that we're talking about, the infrastructure, really does explain what's going on in those different therapies. So just to give you a couple of examples, I'll show you the class objectives for 2 of those classes. The class number 1, where we dive right in, is we start out by talking about what are the subunits of pathology that are specifically the things psychotherapy aims to treat. And those are what we call entrenched maladaptive patterns. Joseph was talking about EMPs as if it's a household word, but it really is something that belongs to SEPI, actually. It was several of us within SEPI who came up with that term. So we do that. And then the next objective is to understand the key role of affect. And here we're, as we'll see a little bit later, we're not talking necessarily about conscious affect. We're talking about affects that are taking place in the limbic system, because those are the ones that really are the triggers for the entrenched maladaptive patterns that we see and that we're trying to change. And third, we talk about the 2 requirements for those healing moments, and those are super important, and we'll look specifically at them in a little bit. The second class that I thought I'd share with you, the objectives, is one on development, and we approach development thinking it's extremely important in having a clear idea of, for example, learning how psychological development clarifies clinical pathology. Let's say somebody feels like you have to be perfect if you're going to be lovable. Well, if that entrenched maladaptive pattern arises very early, then we're going to see the black and white cognition of a very, very young cognitive development. Whereas later on, if there's a little bit more room for that perfect, there are degrees of perfect, then we're talking about a little bit later developmental phase. It might be more like a 7 or 8-year-old begins to have a little bit of softness about those things. The second objective is to begin getting familiarity, and what we do is we break up development into 10 particularly challenging aspects of development. So instead of looking at it as phases or a continuum, we talk about the development of the conscience. We talk about adolescent, what's going on in adolescence, and things like that. And there are a total of 10, so we just touch on them, but enough so that the people taking the course really understand that this is a highly valuable thing to learn a lot more about as you go along. And finally, the value of a working hypothesis. I think this is a very important principle, because when you have a hypothesis, and this has really helped me in my own development over the years, if you've always got an idea of what you think is going on, then you observe much more thoughtfully and accurately, and you find out sometimes that you're dead wrong, and then you have to throw out your hypothesis. But it really helps to start out with an idea instead of just floating along. So those are 2 of the classes, and each of the 10 classes has a similar set of objectives that we try to accomplish, and those are reflected in the fillable workbook as well. So now I'm going to turn to the 3 supporting pillars of science, and so I'm using a little nonverbal communication here with these strong pillars that are holding up an edifice over there. The first one is that evolution shows how the limbic mind is the source of the problems that psychotherapy treats. And we'll go into that a little bit more. The second is that memory reconsolidation, that mechanism that you've probably heard about some, validates what we already know about psychotherapy. It validates existing techniques, but it also gives us the ability, since we can look at exactly what things we're trying to change and what are the requirements for those changes to take place, that allows us to further refine our technique and to get even more precise and more able to influence the processes of therapy. And the third one is a little bit on the fun side, and that is how information science explains and supports the art of psychotherapy. I included this because not too long ago I mentioned something about information, and a colleague said, "Oh, you mean you're not taking emotion into account?" And of course, emotion is a kind of information as far as the mind is concerned. So anyway, we'll talk about that. So going to mind is the source of the problems that psychotherapy treats. So back when psychotherapy was invented, philosophers had a hard time figuring out what's the difference between mind and brain. And, is mind a thing? Is it what? But once we had the idea in the 40s of information processing and a little bit later than that of computers, it gives us a metaphor to be able to understand the difference between the information that flows through your computer and all those transistors that are doing the work, the hardware, and the way that the programming is represented by ones and zeros, just the same as the information it works on. And the mind works the same way. So it's the mind, it's the way the mind treats information that that comes up with the problems that we can hope to change in psychotherapy. And even if a problem is heavily influenced by biology, like anxiety, for example, it's still what we're treating has a lot to do with the information aspects of it. So how does the person respond to their anxiety? And to some extent, what things might have happened in their development that made them anxious about a certain issue. So we're working with the mind, where the medications and a lot of the current research in psychiatry focuses more on the brain, on the hardware. So definition of mind: mind is the information processing function of the brain. A simple definition. And when we look at that mind, and especially the one that's producing these entrenched maladaptive patterns that cause people all kinds of trouble, a good way to talk about it is to personify it as the non-conscious problem solver, or sometimes I talk about the little kid inside or your inner self, different names like that. But we're still talking about something that in humans is very similar to what mammals have as well. And this is where evolution is really helping us to understand. If you get too close to your dog while the dog is eating, you get too close to the bowl, you're going to get a growl. And you've just watched there the operation of a protective system that's very, very similar to the system that we're working on when we're doing psychotherapy. So when you get close to that bowl, what's happening is there's some emotion is getting generated in the limbic system that might not be conscious for human beings. Maybe it's not conscious for dogs, or maybe it is. We just don't know. But what we do see is indirectly, we see the growl, we hear the growl, and that's what tells us that that's a response. That's an adaptive response that's telling us that that system in the midbrain is looking out for protecting that dog. And so we have the same kind of protective system in us that's oriented towards predicting what's going to be a threat and what's going to be an opportunity. And in the case of psychotherapy, we're just about restricting it to threats. Those are the things that cause the troubles that we see. And this automatic non-conscious problem solver is automatic, it's rapid, it's not conscious. Sometimes we get some conscious echoes, or we have a sense of resonance with something that's going on outside of consciousness, but we don't absolutely know. And of course, it doesn't always produce optimal results. So let's take a deeper look at that. We could say that the problems that psychotherapy treats are basically coping gone awry. But let's look at that more closely, because now that we have a way to define exactly what it is that psychotherapy is trying to change and trying to help people trade in for a better response pattern, it turns out that we can learn a whole lot about these many, many different kinds of problems. And so it turns out that the problems that we see are essentially always, we could call them costly answers to existential threats. Why is that? Well, they're existential threats because that's what makes the mind hold on to a response pattern, hold on to an entrenched maladaptive pattern, because life depends on it. And so the brain has evolved to emphasize those patterns and give them a lot of importance. So its existential threats are the ones that produce the lasting maladaptive patterns that bring people into psychotherapy. And And they're costly answers because very often at the time when they're so existentially threatening, the individual has fairly limited abilities to cope. And so they do the best they can, but in adult life, often those coping strategies are not terribly effective, and we can do better. So it turns out when we look really closely at this, that implicit memory, that is, implicit just means not conscious memory in the limbic system, holds rules for life. And those rules are designed to soften and quiet down the distressing limbic emotions that go on there. And those rules are exactly the things that we want to change. We want to rewrite the rules. What do the rules do? They determine how dangerous is the threat, what is the best strategy for coping with this threat, and very importantly, are we going to be successful? Do we have the strength and the power to be able to overcome this threat? Because what you'll see is the reaction, the response is very different when we think that we don't have the ability to overcome a threat. We see a very different kind of response than when the mind calculates that we can handle this kind of problem. So, second point here is that limbic emotion. Now, this is also a term that I use that's not really adopted anyplace else that I know of, but I think it's extremely useful for us clinically to remember that the problem responses we see are triggered by a few neurons in the amygdala in particular that light up, and those send a signal to other places in the midbrain, in the limbic brain, that generate the response itself. And so limbic emotion is right at the center of this protective system. So the implicit memory has the rules. The rules, when they say, yes, we need a response, then limbic emotion is triggered and the response will happen. So let's just look really quickly at how some of these entrenched maladaptive patterns turn out to be costly. Some of them, as I already mentioned about perfection, are where the young mind has absolutes, and just that you have to be absolutely perfect or absolutely responsible, and there's no room for excuses. We see a lot of that. Sometimes when like my patient whose father discouraged success, he said, seeking success is uncouth, it's not becoming, you should never do that. And so the patient quit his PhD program and never developed a career. And now late in his adulthood, he's beginning to realize that that was a compromise that he made to be loyal to his father. Sometimes we see repetition as a strategy where the mind either goes through a behavior over and over again, or ideas or thoughts over and over and over again, as if that's a strategy for solving a problem, which of course it doesn't, but it does put off the problem, and it keeps up a hope that somehow something's going to happen. Maybe there'll be a different outcome. Waiting for something to happen. How many people who've been neglected in early childhood will keep on through their life looking for somebody to give them the primal love that they missed out on, and they just keep waiting and looking to the wrong kinds of people to do that. Then there are problems that are problematic or troublesome because they involve changing others by proxy. Maybe if I can get this person to admit that they really did a bad job, like mom did a bad job, then I'm going to feel better and I won't have to be angry anymore. I can forgive. And then there's ones like panic attacks are often a response to the unthinkable. When the mind has a rule that says such and such must not ever happen, and then it happens, what's the mind going to do? Well, it pulls out all the stops and you have a panic attack. That's one of the kinds of response. So that's a little rundown on different ways that coping that seemed like the best that could be done at the time turns out to be maladaptive when you get later, and brings people into therapy. And that's what we want to trade in for something better. How do we do it? We're going to rewrite the rules. And here is a sort of informal catalog of entrenched maladaptive patterns, just to show you the incredibly wide variety of problems that psychotherapy can deal with. And what all these have in common is they all have to do with responses that are generated by the mind in response to something that's perceived as a threat. I want you to focus on the last one in particular because it's interesting. Resistance to change. So you imagine the non-conscious problem solver who is holding on for dear life to a strategy to deal with some kind of an existential threat. And then you come along as a therapist and you say, oh, wow, that's terrible. I'm going to help you get rid of that. And the non-conscious, the adult patient says, oh, that's great. Okay, let's go for it. But the non-conscious problem solver is saying, oh, no, this is terrible. This can't be. Let's not. And develops a new layer of entrenched maladaptive pattern, just similar to the other layers, but it's a new one that's produced actually as a result of the therapy. And that's one of the ways that we get what is often called resistance in therapy, not meaning conscious obstructionism, but actually an unconsciously created maladaptive pattern that works against the therapy. So now I'm going to go to the second pillar of science that supports psychotherapeutic technique and gives us some more precision, and that is memory reconsolidation. And the two requirements for memory reconsolidation that really we're going to go right to those are activation of the old pattern, then that needs to happen at the same time as Joseph was alluding to, an antidote, some new, surprising, disconfirming information that shows the limbic system that the old way isn't necessary anymore, that we can change it now. The corrective emotional experience is one way that this has been described in the past. And another one is the Boston Study Group on Change in Psychotherapy talks about moments of meeting, those special healing moments when people are changed permanently, and it doesn't require further reinforcement for those changes to stay in place. So I just want to share with you some pioneers in this area. Karim Nader is the scientist who's credited with having elucidated the neurochemistry of memory reconsolidation and shown how it's very different from other change mechanisms and how it's permanent and what those two requirements are. That was in the year 2000, and another important paper in 2004 that kicked off this whole line of research entirely independent from the psychotherapy field, but turns out to be extremely relevant because this is the only explanation we have for those healing moments. We don't have another way to explain them. The second one is Bruce Ecker, who is a clinician in New York City and has been a pioneer and a champion of the idea of incorporating memory reconsolidation in the way we think about therapy and seeing how it's manifested in many different ways in different therapies. And he's been gathering a large collection of clinical examples of change that takes place as a result of memory reconsolidation. And then there's Richard Lane, is a friend from the University of Arizona, who is also a SEPI member and has written an important paper in 2015 about memory reconsolidation and wrote a book in 2020, I believe, on how memory reconsolidation is relevant to many different traditional therapies and gives a very strong scientific underpinning for that. So let's look at those two requirements for memory reconsolidation. The first one, we've got a picture of a person whose old pattern is highly activated there, and implicit memory in the amygdala generally holds that rule that determines the response. And I mentioned the three different things that those rules determine, and that those are the things we want to change. So the old rule needs to be in a neurologically active state. And second, we get indirect clinical indicators of that activation. It's not something that is directly conscious, but we do have resonance And sometimes we have conscious awareness of feeling, but feelings that are more elaborate, that have associations and more complexity to them. But when you think of this activation, think of the dog who growls and what's going on in their limbic system. Something that's very special about this is that if you look at the concepts of traditional psychotherapies, like Freudian concepts like the id and the ego and things like that, those are invented, and they don't really, if you ask a behaviorist, have you ever seen an id? They'll say, no, I've never seen one. What is that? But on the other hand, this activation and that limbic emotion are things that can actually be measured with electrodes in animals and with scans in humans. And so as clinicians, we don't get to do scans and electrodes, but we can see the indirect indicators. And those are the physiological changes that come as a result of activation in the limbic system, like tears or change in breathing or posture or wiggling around. All of those things are indications that something's active, something's going on there. And sometimes all we see is the response itself by itself without the affect, even as when the limbic activation is more outside of consciousness than that. And every therapy has techniques for activating the old pattern. So we have a little bit of time, and I'd like you all to think about, and if you want to put in the chat here really quickly, take your favorite therapy, brand of therapy, and ask yourself, how does that therapy activate old patterns that need to change? Or if somebody wants to unmute themselves, you can say it out loud. You know, how does CBT do it?
Hello, this is Leslie here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The chat's disabled, but anyway, one of the first things that I thought was sometimes art or therapy could activate something. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's just one. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there are many others. Transference is a terrific activator of old patterns. And verbal exploration does it, and prolonged exposure does it. 2-chair exercises do it. So every therapy has its own ways to activate those old patterns. Because intuition just told the inventors of those therapies that that's what you needed to do. And we all kind of sense that. When we see affect, we say, oh, something important is going on here. This is an opportunity.
I don't know whether you can hear. Oh, there I am. I do lots of couple therapy, Jeffrey, as you know, and actually just getting two unhappily married people in the same room together and having them talk about what's troubling is very activating of their deeper issues and their
Oh boy.
solutions. You almost don't have to do it. It's one of the great things about it.
That's
You don't
right.
have to do anything special.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. So then at the same time, then we're going to go on to requirement number 2, and that is bringing in, I like to think of it as a new perspective. It's what I call the antidote, and we could call it disconfirming information. Disconfirming what? Disconfirming some aspect of those implicit rules that need to get written. So the disconfirming information, first of all, triggers the volatility of those synapses that define memory. Those clumps of neurons that tend to fire together that represent a clump of information in the mind. If you have trouble thinking of these rules, think about the rules of grammar. Those are nonverbal. We learn them somehow. We don't know where they're stored, but they're somewhere in the limbic system or around there. They operate very quickly and accurately. Now, just imagine if the mind puts that much energy into rules of grammar, how much energy it puts into programming that operates on the various inputs from past memory and new information of what's happening right now. And that information then gets crunched by this logic, this programming in the limbic system, which then makes those decisions, and those are the decisions that either do or don't result in a maladaptive pattern getting acted out. And so, so this larger perspective is the information that disconfirms the old pattern and that is the basis of rewriting it. And so it has those two functions in a way. What I like to emphasize about that is that there are different flavors of perspective or new information. It can be emotional, it can be logical, it can be bodily, even circumstantial. But let's think about that. The kind of the simplest example is what Freud called catharsis, is when trauma clients tell us about their traumatic experiences and share that with emotion, and they tend to walk out of the session feeling better. Well, what happened? Memory reconsolidation happened, because it's the source of disconfirming information is probably not the words you use. You know, maybe you said, "Oh, it's all over now. It's you know, the trauma is done with, and we're just going to help you leave it behind." Those words are okay, but they're not what does the heavy lifting. What really does the work is your attitude. It's your tone of voice. It's the way. It's the reassuring sense that the client has from you that tells them that it's really okay now. And so that's emotional. Les Greenberg, the originator of emotion-focused therapy, calls it healing emotion with emotion. So when you bring in an emotional, that's information. That's emotion that changes, that disconfirms the scary emotion that the person has. When we use clinical mindfulness, it's a similar sort of thing, where the person is experiencing something distressing and they're all focused on themselves and kind of turned inwards, dealing with whatever threat it was. And we want them to say, you know, let's look at it from a bigger perspective. These things come and go. It's going to be okay tomorrow. And it's not something that you have to worry about. You can let it be. So that's disconfirming information. And again, most of it is the nonverbal part. Then it can sometimes the logic, sometimes the words are really important. And my patient, I love to mention the one who came in one day and said, "I joined a boxing club." Well, what was that about? Well, she had been abused as a child and really learned to be to a fawning behavior. When people wanted to control her, she just let them do it. She was a doormat in a way. And as she began to realize that it was healthy to have some power and to be more assertive, then she found that joining the boxing club and punching the heavy bag as hard as she could was a way of sending information into her limbic system that power is safe, that it's okay to be strong. And the words wouldn't have done it. Even the tone of voice didn't do it. She really needed that bodily information to touch her limbic system and bring the new information. So I'd like you again, I'm not going to stop here because we're not that good on time, but think about ways that different therapies have of providing that information. And do the therapies that you like, do they have enough of a breadth? Do they recognize the importance of the nonverbal and the bodily, as well as the things that you might say in words? So now I'm going to go to the third pillar, which is really about the art of psychotherapy. And the key here is that the flexibility of the human mind. If we think about data science or data processing, we think about computers that have very rigid data types, integers, text, colors expressed in a number. They're all reduced to ones and zeros, and they're very rigid. And if and then statements are used to process these things in your computer. But the mind treats everything as information. It might be, think about two fashion designers who talk about a look, and they know what they're talking about, but they couldn't define it in words. It's just a look. Well, that's something that the mind can grasp and remember. and communicate via metaphors. That's what the mind is really good for. That's why at the bottom, I like to say the mind is a metaphor engine. It's good at finding things that are equivalent to something else and seeing the association between the two, which is the foundation of creativity, and is a very powerful way to process information. In fact, that's what AI uses now, since AI was really built on a model trying to use the same kind of techniques that the mind does. So the information types then in the mind are undefined and unlimited, and that's why and as we do therapy, we need to use our intuition and empathy to be able to communicate with the limbic system where these rules that we want to change are being held. So that's why this diagram here, where I've used the heart as a metaphor for the limbic system, and we have a complex communication where your limbic system is telling your consciousness things, and your consciousness is sending some words maybe and plus nonverbal over to your client, and they're taking it in, and then it's going into their limbic system. There's a lot of steps of translation there, and so it's very important to get it right. And not only do we want to use things that are generally accessible to the limbic mental processing, but we also need to realize that everybody's limbic system is different and operates different. Metaphors really resonate differently, and so on. So we need to listen and use our own limbic system to get in tune with our client and be able to communicate so that the communications go into the places where they're really needed. So this second requirement of communicating disconfirming information, that sounds very dry on the surface, but in reality, in clinical use, it involves nonverbal information, cognitive information, circumstantial information like the soft pillows in your office. Those are sending a message. Bodily information, as I mentioned, and one more that I think is underappreciated in psychotherapy is the power of behavior change. That in CBT, when you might suggest somebody try a piece of homework or a new behavior, that has tremendous emotional reverberations in the limbic system. If anybody who's seen the TV show What Not to Wear, you've seen people who've agreed to try dressing in a whole unfamiliar way for them, and it has an incredible impact on their emotions. They sometimes freak out. So anyway, that's really how the science of information processing in the mind tells us a lot about what we need to do to be good therapists and to enjoy the art of psychotherapy. And it also says that however smart we may get and however we can boil down what's going on to a science, we're not going to be able to replace the art, because that's part of working with the mind using its enormously wide range of communication types. And so here I'm using another piece of nonverbal communication. I'm going right to your limbic system with this lovely picture of a community, of a bunch of people who are relating together, and you all get a feeling from that, right? So this is just a slide to represent the psychotherapy coaching. Coaching is different. It's something that we can do online where we can invite people who come from places that I don't have a license to practice in. And so coaching is not the same as mentoring or supervision. It's something that gives people ways of thinking, ways of approaching a given problem, and alternatives, and also provides a place for the community to get together and share experiences with each other. And we have a couple of at least 2 members of our community, 3, I think, if not more, here today. So I'm going to ask Kelly to talk a little bit about how this, as I did with Joseph, how this framework has affected your personal practice. What have you been doing, maybe in a more detailed way, to make use of it? And we can open it up for questions. I think that's probably the best thing to do. So a couple of minutes from you, Kelly, on this. Let me stop the share.
Great.
So we've got, it's 10 after 10 after the hour now. We're going to try and wrap up by about 1/2 past. So
Mhm.
yeah, Kelly, if you could just talk for a few minutes about your experience, I would like to make sure we have some time for questions from participants.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. We, at our practice, the first thing that we did is it's kind of like we use the science and the art, and we broke down a lot of what Jeffrey teaches in his courses using his book. And it really helped give everybody just a real understanding of this framework. One of the things that Dr. Smith is so good at is making concepts simple. But the thing that we all know is that this isn't simple. The mind is so complicated. And so mixing that in with the art has been really helpful. And, you know, we talked a little bit, Joseph did, and Dr. Smith, about kind of this making better hypotheses. And so we spend every week, we go over a different client and we use this format to sort of make it as simple as we can. Let's make better hypotheses. And so we go through the EMPs, the dread, and I could tell you so many anecdotes about people that I supervise, or, sessions I've had myself, or having that direction has really moved into those healing moments so much quicker. And sometimes it doesn't go quick. And I think that's like important to name. But knowing where you're going makes such a difference. Knowing that this is hard for a reason makes such a difference. So we really dig into finding better ways to hypothesize our clients, and mixing that in with that teamwork together. And yes, I'm a part of the community. And that has been such a valuable thing. I think one thing that young clinicians might do is they might think that they're on the top of their game, and then they get out for a few years and realize how much there is to know and to learn. And learning from someone like Dr. Smith, who's been doing it and is a lifelong learner, has been so influential for our team, for our community. And it's such a rare way to get to lean on each other and learn from somebody who's really been there before. So that's a little bit about how we implement it over in our little corner of the world.
Kelly, and thank you, Jeffrey, for the nice overview. I know you're trying to summarize a 10-hour course into 40 minutes, so thank you for that. And what questions do participants have for Jeffrey or for Kelly, or comments? I think everyone has their permission to talk. So Fazia, do you have your hand up? Would you like to speak?
Yes. So can I turn on my camera?
Yeah. Let me make you into a panelist, and then you can do that. So go.
Yes. Yeah. So
Okay, there you are. Now we can see you.
Hi everyone.
Hi,
And
Fazia.
if anyone else wants to talk after Fazia, go ahead and raise your hand, and I will promote you to panelist so we can see you. Go ahead, Fazia.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I don't have a question. I'm one of the participants in the first course, the initial pilot course. So I just want to share my experience. I completely agree with Kelly and Dr. Joseph. He was one of the giving lectures during that course. So I'm a resident right now at Rutgers, New York, and I just I was so thankful to Dr. Smith for starting this some teaching course for residents and fellows, because as Dr. Joseph has discussed, there is tremendous need that we are always confused, what therapy we should be using in the end. We have no clue. So by attending this course, at least I was able to at least know that at what moment I can shift from CBT to psychodynamic to my extent. I'm not an expert in psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, but at least I know that I can switch. It's not like you have to stick to just one kind of therapy. It's not mandatory. And I highly recommend to all the resident fellows to attend Dr. Smith's course, or even experienced therapist. I mean, you will be learning at your level, and the resident and fellows will be learning from their level. It was incredibly, I would say, that inspiring to attend that course, and incredibly helpful for us.
Thank you, Fazia. Does anybody else have a question for Jeffrey or anyone else? If you raise your hand, I will give you the camera. Okay, Leslie. Yeah. Okay, let me. Okay, Leslie, I'm going to promote you to panelist so that you can turn on your camera.
Oh, okay.
See your smiling face.
You can talk anyway.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I see it. Yeah, okay. So
There you go.
Now we see you.
It's not really I'll be very brief, and it's triggered by just a client, two parents and a son that I see as a family, you know. So just the idea of the pacing of when you say I'd have in that one session, I had a hypothesis about how the family had formed a kind of a system where he was the problem child. In other words, he's the definition of the problem in the family. It's personified in him since he was 4 years of age, that kind of thing. That was my hypothesis. And so I explained that to the boy on his own, a 19-year-old. And I think I checked with him. Are you getting, does that make sense to you that you were the kind of problem child and you've become that in the system? And he was staring into space, but he was agreeing with me. So now I couldn't do that in the first session with him because he would have got highly activated. He would have said to me, who do you think you are? That kind of thing. So I suppose I'm just posing that question then. There's something about timing, isn't there, about what Freud might have thought, the interpretation, the timing of your engagement comments, the timing of how you're interpreting things for them. If you're want to highlight something, the timing of all of that. Have you any thoughts on that, Doctor?
Boy, that what comes to mind is intuition, you know, is what is a person going to be able to tolerate versus what's going to trigger a real uncomfortable reaction, and so we do want to take things step by step, and sometimes they're very small steps, and sometimes we can go right in, and you know, just like a parent, you can never get it right all the time. You're going to do your best, but guessing how another person is going to respond to something is way more art than science, and it's impossible to be right all the time.
That's true.
I'm on mute. I was mute. We're going to move the other Leslie Becker Phelps for the next question. And again, thanks for raising your hand if you have a question. Go ahead, Leslie.
So on your slide, on one of the last, maybe the last one, one of the last ones, you showed the picture of the two people with the arrows going head to heart, and the arrows between them. To me, it makes me think of the head to heart is, you familiar with mentalization-based treatment?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And to me, that is a picture of couples therapy with a mentalization focus.
Mm-hmm.
It would fit with EFT too. And you also said, so that's how I was interpreting the picture, right? That's how I think a lot of the therapy I do. You talk about that, the hypotheses help you move to healing moments. Somebody said that along the way. And I guess what I wonder is, what do you mean by that? And does that fit with taking a mentalization-based approach in terms of hypothesizing, because you're going to mentalize the person and then join with them and move it forward? Or is there some other piece to this? Or if you could clarify, that would be great.
Sure. I think that mentalization really focuses on the second requirement of memory reconsolidation. That is, mentalization is about that larger perspective that we bring to the the more self-centered experience that a person might have, and you want them to step outside themselves and to be able to experience themselves from a larger perspective. Does that sound like what you're talking about?
That would be the part, yes, that we want to move the patient to. But my thought is that as who's not in that picture is the therapist. And my thought is with the mentalization, the first part would be the joining, using your mentalization to join with the person to help them then move out of it. So that would be, in my mind, the first piece.
You know, as soon as you share with your client something that your understanding of what they've been communicating to you, or as soon as you help them to articulate, to describe to you something they're experiencing, you automatically create a mentalization experience. Because as soon as you're saying something about yourself, you're doing a meta communication. You know, you're looking at yourself to describe what's going on. So it's a very interesting thing that there's two elements to that. There's feeling the thing, and there's expressing it both to yourself, because you're listening when you're speaking, you're listening to yourself and the other person who is also listening. So it's there's a lot to it, but I think that it's what's helpful about the framework we're talking about is to realize that those two elements, the experiencing element, that's the activation of the old pattern, and the mentalization aspect, which is looking at it from a larger perspective. And they both need to happen at the same time. They're both necessary. So I think mentalization tends to make you think more about the outside perspective, but implied in that is the inner experience as well.
Just to clarify, at least my well, from some of the training I took, with the mentalization, they look at the external and internal, right? So they're dividing that. And so there is the focus internally. And I'm just wondering, is the thing that we're talking about now, is that related to the hypotheses you use to move forward? Or is that like a different part of the...
Well, that concept of hypothesis is really a broad brush, and it covers a lot of things. But specifically, I think among the hypotheses that Kelly was talking about are trying to articulate which exactly of those rules that are those nonverbal rules held in the limbic system are behind the problem behavior that we see, or the problem experience that we're seeing, and what are exactly those rules that we would like to change, that we'd like to help our client trade in for a better one. Like, you don't have to be absolutely perfect. You can want to be perfect and be happy with what you can achieve. You know, that would be a trade-in for a more rigid maladaptive rule.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Leslie. We have time for one more question. Does somebody else want to ask one more question? So I'll ask you a question, Jeffrey. Is memory reconsolidation a common factor?
No. Common factors are correlations. They're not explanations. Common factors, as we know them, as the research has been done, is all about what factors can we identify in a therapy that correlate highly with success. And so memory reconsolidation is an explanation. It is a common element, and I like to make that distinction because if you look at the traditional common factors, they don't really address the specific problems that people bring in the door. They address the general conditions that are helpful to people on a broad base and should be part of every therapy. And so for purposes of training, I think it's useful to distinguish and think of the difference between correlations and explanations. Okay, so we are at about time. We
I appreciate Jeffrey and Joe and Kelly talking about their experience. So if people want to sign up for your 10-hour class, Jeffrey, how do they do that?
They go to howtherapyworks.com. It's all one word. And in the navigation, there's a tab for course and the courses and a tab for the coaching. And each of them is priced at $97 for the course, $97 for an introductory 3-month membership in the community.
And do you get continuing education credit for the course?
We don't, because it's intended for therapists of every professional group and internationally, and there's just too many accrediting bodies to do that. So we're hoping that the value of the material that we have makes it worthwhile, even if it doesn't get you credit.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for participating. We're going to have another, I don't know the date of the next one. Where do I have that notebook? There's another one in March. Where do I have that? So the
25th.
Thank you. There
Good.
it is, the 25th. You're correct. Thanks, Leslie. So the next webinar is going to be on March 25th. It's going to be a little earlier in the day. Sergey Prengal is going to talk about focusing as a foundation for integrative psychotherapy. And so I'll be listing this on the SEPI web listserv. And I'm sorry for a couple of the registration problems. About 3 hours ago, Jeffrey and I were looking at the web thing, and I unpressed the register button for a second, and then I couldn't get it back. So the people that got in late, that was my fault. I think the Zoom is an amazing technology, and there's room for errors. So
will the session be available for people to view
Yes.
afterwards?
So we've recorded it, and so that's why I did it through the SEPI Zoom thing and not through my own. So it was this is going to be hassle over here, but hopefully we can record it. So hopefully this will be posted on the SEPI website. So on behalf of the SEPI Education and Training Committee, I want to thank Jeffery Smith. I want to thank Kelly Oldham, and I want to thank all of you for participating. So have a great day, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.